This is the question I'm going to be answering: how to apply for a job. Essentially, what we're going to be talking about is applications, the whole application process, and what you need to think about in order to be as successful as possible in this, really. So, in terms of, I guess, the application stage, just to sort of explain how it works a little bit, the application stage is probably the hardest part of this whole process, in the sense that it's around a quarter of all applications that get through to the next stage, get through to an interview. Now, that could feel quite positive, that could feel quite daunting. It'll depend on the person. I guess what I would say is that the application is the one part of the process that you have complete control over. You craft your CV, you craft your application form, you decide what goes in it, what doesn't go into it. It is a big opportunity in that way, in that it's something you have control over and something you can get better at. So while that sort of ratio, that 75 to 25%, might seem a bit daunting, honestly, this is a part of the process you can get quite a lot better at. So if you view it that way, as something that you can iterate on, it takes a lot of the sting out of the process, right? For you, though, what you've got to appreciate is that this is a marketing exercise. So you essentially have to give the employer what they want, what they are looking for. And there's a little bit of a formula to this in terms of what an employer is looking for. But it's really easy to predict in a lot of ways. On a very broad level, what an employer is looking for is skills, the ability to do certain things. Now, that is something I'm going to focus on in a lot of regards, because what people say to me when I talk about CVs, cover letters, when I have one-to-ones, is that I don't have experience. I don't have work experience that's relevant. That's very common. The key to this is to remember that employers aren't really looking for experience. They're looking for skills. They're looking for evidence that you can do certain things. We've got quite a long list of, I guess, generic ones on the screen. These are, I guess, broadly speaking, some of the most common ones that an employer is going to look for, but they will actually tell you in a few key ways the specific ones that they are looking for. Those will be straight from a job description or a person specification. And it's up to you to evidence those skills. In addition, you also have to demonstrate why you want that job. Demonstrate your understanding of the role, your enthusiasm for it, and your motivation to want to work for that company by demonstrating you actually understand what that organization does and how that might be different to other organizations. So you've also got to make them feel a little bit special, right? Now, these parts they're relatively easy, but there are, I guess, some steps before and during an application that I want you guys to undertake. Now, before I sort of go into this, it's very common, or I get told a lot, well, this is a lot of work. An application will take time. It will take effort. There's no getting around it. In order to make a good application, that is important to say. And I would always argue that it is better to spend this time on fewer applications and send out fewer applications than send out loads of applications that you haven't really spent all that much time on. You'll get much better return on investment that way, I would suggest. So the first thing that you want to do before you apply to something is research the organization. This will help you get an idea of what it is they are looking for. You can think about the kind of person that works there. Look at things like the people that work there on LinkedIn. What's their background? What do they talk about? Look at their websites, their About Us, services, their team. What do they talk about on their website? What is important to them? A few other useful resources, things like Glassdoor, things like Prospects that I'm hoping you're all familiar with. prospects can help you with things like skills profiles to get an idea of what it is they are going to ask of you. And if you have the time, if you have the opportunity, any kind of networking events, careers fairs are a really good example. Doing that little bit of prep work before you are getting to the application stage can put you in a really good position. Okay. The reason I am focusing on these things and skills in particular is because of what they will expect you to do, what questions they will ask in an application, but also how they will expect you to demonstrate these things. And I usually do that by asking a question. The first one would be, are you a good communicator? Now, if you think about that as a question, the answer is obvious, right? It's yes. You are not going to say, I am a bad communicator. Well, you would hope you're not going to say that. So they don't ask these questions in that form. What they ask is what's called a competency-based question. Give me an example of a time when. Describe a situation when you have. How did you use X skill? This is what they are looking for, and you can immediately see this is harder, right? There is a formula to how to answer these. Some of you might be aware of it, so forgive me if I'm going into detail on stuff that you're aware of. But this is what they will ask. And even if they don't ask these questions, if they just give you a piece of writing to try and address certain criteria that I'll talk about later on, they will expect you to approach demonstrating these skills with these questions in mind. We call them competency-based questions. You've got to demonstrate competencies. Now, to predict this or to get an idea of what it is they are going to ask, there are two things that I want you to bear in mind. Two documents that are going to be I describe them as a cheat sheet for these applications, right? And they're called the job description and the person specification. Now, they are different documents. It's important to understand that. And they are both useful. And a pro tip, any job that you apply to, you need to write your application towards the job description and towards the person specification. But I would also suggest keeping these two documents once you've applied, because they're also extremely useful for the interview stage. And what a lot of people do is they'll apply to a job, nail the application, forget to save these documents, and then when it comes time to prepare for the interview, they don't have them. And quite often companies will take these adverts down. So it's a really good idea to keep these documents to every application you make. Now, these documents, just to explain them, job description, it kind of does what it says. What it allows you to do is what we call self-select. It gives you an idea of what the actual job is. Do you want to do that? And it's used in recruitment to increase objectivity. There's a specific thing that we need these people to be able to do. Here it is on paper. We know what we're judging you against. Like I say, very useful document, but not, I guess, the key. It's helpful, definitely. And one of the questions that I've seen come up at interview quite often is, what do you actually understand the job to be? That can demonstrate someone who hasn't read the job description, because that can throw people quite a lot. So it's still quite useful. However, the person specification is the real sort of silver bullet, right? What this does is describe an ideal candidate. It will go in detail about each individual skill, personal attribute, knowledge, qualification that they are looking for. And quite often it'll be split into essential requirements and desirable requirements. Now, in your application, you need to make sure that you've demonstrated how you fit every individual bullet point on that person specification. That is what a good application will do. Because what they will do is, when they are actually recruiting, they will have these documents to hand, right? So got two examples here, job description on the left, person specification on the right, and you'll see quite different. And literally on the person specification, every single bullet point is evidence there. You will need to provide evidence for each of those bullet points. That is what we're looking for in a application rather. Now they'll do this in different ways. Sometimes it will be a CV and a cover letter. What we're seeing more often, actually, what we're seeing very often now is being asked for what's called a supporting statement. Okay. This is quite common for roles in the public sector. It's what we ask for as a university when we're recruiting, and we are seeing them become more common. Now, I only mention the supporting statement particularly because I found that some people confuse them with things like personal statements. They are different things. A personal statement quite often is just a sort of essay around how you want to do something, how good you are at something, why you would want to do something. Very often they're used for things like courses, applications. If you hear a supporting statement, that is something that's different. And I just want you to be aware of that so you don't do what I've seen quite a lot of people do. And actually, it's what I used to do before I sort of understood what they were. The temptation is to write a bit of an essay and write a long essay about how you fit that particular job. I would actually suggest that rather than do something like that, instead go back to the person specification and use each of these individual bullet points as a heading. And under that heading, you want one concrete star example. A star example is something I will explain in about 5 minutes and later on in the session about how you fit that criteria. And even better, if you can lay it out in the same order that those bullet points appear on the person specification. So you'd get something like this. So you see each individual heading, each individual bullet point is one of those headings, and then you've got a paragraph that demonstrates how you fit that criteria, how you have demonstrated that particular skill. Now that again is going to be quite a bit of effort. These things do take quite a long time to write. It can, take a couple of days. However, if you do it like this, you have a far better chance of getting through to the next stage, because the reality is most people don't do this. But by doing this, you make the interviewer, the recruiter's life quite a lot easier, and they will love you for it. They will be able to make a decision about whether they should interview you really, really quickly, and usually really, really positively. Okay. Now, the reason I am sort of harping on this is because of how recruitment works. Now, put yourself in the mind of that recruiter, the person who is doing the shortlisting, right? The way shortlisting works, so this is how they decide who comes to interview, is they'll agree this person specification, and what they will do is look through each individual application, whatever that application consists of, whether it's CV and covering letter, a supporting statement, application questions, or whatever, and they will literally systematically, essentially, score you. And think about that for a minute. Think about that whole process. How would you actually do it? Imagine, and this, I can give you a recent example. So for the last role we put out, we got 150 applications. How are you going to do that? How are you going to decide on who gets the interview there? You actually use something like this. This is called a selection grid. So along the top, we've got all the key skills that we've asked for. They're taken directly from the person specification. Dead simple, easy to predict. Then on the left, all the names of the people that have applied. And for each of these skills, we will give you a score. Now I've used 1 to 4 here, might be 1 to 5, 1 to 10. It doesn't really matter, because at the end, all those scores are added up, and then it's the top scores that get invited to interview, right? Now, if you go back to that supporting statement idea and how I said lay it out in the way that the person specification is laid out, what you then allow someone to do is go through each individual bullet point, give you a score immediately, move on to the next one. it just becomes a lot easier. Whereas if you've written an essay, then you're expecting the person reading it to read the whole thing and then reread it again for all of those individual skills and pick bits out and then give you scores and then maybe see if there's later on in the essay and this, that, and the other. It becomes a lot harder for the person reading it. And then there's no guarantee they'll find the correct bit that gives you that really good score. If you do this in a more systematic way, you are going to get a much better chance of getting a high score. And that's what you need to do. Think of it like a game, right? The goal of the game is to get that high score. That gets you to the interview. So if you can look at your application, if you can look at your CV, if you can look at your cover letter and think about the key skills they're asking for and give yourself a score and be brutal with yourselves because, there's no guarantee an employer's going to be nice. If you can get good at that process, then you can be reasonably sure that you can get through to the next stage on the regular, which puts you in a fantastic position. Now, if you do have any questions, because I'm aware I'm going at a decent pace, please do put any questions in the chat and I'll get through to them as we go. But that's all very well and good, me telling you about this score. How would you get a high score? How would you demonstrate any of those individual skills? The thing that we teach and the thing that we find from employers is what they actually want is something called the STAR technique. I mentioned it earlier. This is a way to construct those paragraphs, and this is what you will be scored against. So you think of that, what we're trying to do is demonstrate a skill. So the S of the STAR is the situation. What is the context? When did you demonstrate this skill? Then the task. What were you trying to achieve? What were you trying to do with this skill? Those two, the S and the T there, are your opening. They can be like a couple of sentences, no more. Doesn't have to be. Then the A, which is the most important part, the action. What you did and how you did it. And the how is the really important part. You have to give a level of detail that could almost feel a bit embarrassing because you'll think you're going over the absolute basics. But by doing that, you demonstrate that you know what you're talking about. That's where it really comes in. And then you finish with the result. What happened as a result of what you did? And as much detail, as specific detail as you can, right? And to demonstrate how this works, I'm going to give you an example. So imagine, and we'll use an interview because it tends to be a bit simpler, that you are on an interview panel and this is the question you've asked. Give me an example of a time when you've worked well as part of a team, and this is what you've been given. I play football twice a week as part of a county team. We've won 6 out of 8 matches this season. What score do you think you would give it? Put scores in the chat for me if you can. Would it be a 0, which would be no evidence? Would it be a 1, some experience but lacks evidence? 2, some evidence? Or 3, a detailed account? And think about that sort of STAR technique that I've talked about. What do you think you would give it? So for me, depends on, I guess, how I'm feeling to an extent. I'd probably give it between a 0 and a 1. So if you think about that STAR technique for a minute, they've given you a situation, you've assumed a task maybe, they've given you a result, there's no real action there, and there's no real connection between those two sentences. For all I know, they could have been on the bench for the matches that they won and playing for the matches that they lost and been the direct cause of why they lost those matches. There's nothing there. Now I'm going to add 2 sentences and I think immediately make this better. During matches, I listen to teammates for instructions. Communicate with the coach about how I could play better. You'll see this immediately, there's more detail here. But if you think back to that STAR technique that I was talking about, What do you think you would give it here? I'll give you a second to think. But if you think critically here, do you think it's better than the one I've just shown you? Is it all the way to a three? For me, I'd probably say it's between a two and a three, but probably closer to a two. It's better. It's definitely better, right? But it's not a level of detail that actually we really need. For me, what I would want to make this stronger would be a specific match that they won because I demonstrated teamwork. So a specific match that they communicated well. Maybe they were losing at half time, they regrouped. What was your contribution to that team? What happened as a result of what you did to make sure that you won that match? Remember, a level of detail that almost feels embarrassing because you will be going over the basics. If it's something like communication and you are talking about presentation that you are giving or have given, did you use a PowerPoint? How did you construct the PowerPoint? Did you think about your language and how you would be understood by your audience and how they might not be able necessarily to understand all of the things you were saying? So, did you vary your language to make sure that everyone got what you were talking about? You've got to go over the basics. You've got to give specific detail and all the way through quantifying. So, for that presentation idea again, what was your grade? Did you get feedback? What was the feedback? What was positive? What was negative? How would you do it differently? How would you improve? All the way through, you've got to be reading what you're writing and asking, can I put some more detail in here? Can I be more specific? And there are a few things when you're writing these that I want you to avoid. Some phrases that I put on the screen. I see this very often, but I do this all the time. This skill is really important to my work. I work effectively to achieve my goals. These are too generic. They don't tell me anything and they reek of someone that doesn't actually know what they're talking about. Because, yeah, I do that all the time. Communication is really important and I make sure I communicate clearly and effectively. How do you communicate clearly and effectively? I manage my time effectively to achieve goals. How do you manage your time? That how is the bit that most people forget, but it is the bit that will get you that highest score. So just to demonstrate what I mean with some more concrete examples, here are, I guess, some more, what would I say, developed examples. Here we've got one for leadership. So the question here would be, give an example of time you've demonstrated strong leadership skills. Here, whilst working as a volunteer coordinator, situation, done. Had to organise a team of 40 volunteers involving 500 competitors. So already really specific detail. You are giving me numbers. That demonstrates you actually know what you're talking about. This actually happened. I did this by giving them clear, concise instructions before the event, motivated by checking throughout the race, as well as ensuring plenty of water and snacks. You understand what motivates people. This is good. This is better. Still not perfect. The event was a success and well run with specific positive feedback. What was the feedback? Why was it positive? How was it positive? So better, definitely, but we would still want more here. Another example, which I think is probably the best one. So describe a time you've had to influence or persuade someone. As a secretary of the university football team, had to raise funds. Great. Situation and task. What I did, 25 companies contacted, arranged to visit each one in order to effectively communicate the concept of sponsoring, and you can see all the way through specific, relevant detail. Not going overboard. They're not writing a whole essay on each individual point, but wherever they can, they are giving specific detail that demonstrates they know what they're talking about. And then if we look at the result, this led to a year-long sponsorship deal with a local recruitment agency. It's something really concrete. This is what we are after. This is how to write an effective application. This will really get you to the next level. Now, having said all that, the evidence is really important. That evidence needs to come from you. But the good news is that that evidence can basically come from anywhere. So it's very common for people to sit there once I've gone through all this and say, well, I don't have work experience, or the work experience I have isn't relevant. So what do I do? I promise you, anything, any evidence can be relevant, whether it's from work experience, that would obviously be great, whether it's relevant or not, all it's got to do is demonstrate the skill. But if you don't have that work experience, your course is relevant, any voluntary work you've done, extracurricular stuff, things like sport, anything cultural, even family responsibilities, evidence can be taken from anything. All it has to do is demonstrate that specific skill. Please don't feel, because I know this is quite a common anxiety, but don't feel like you don't have anything to talk about. I promise you, you do. The very fact you're at university studying tells me you've got something to talk about. All you've got to do is demonstrate those skills with STAR techniques. So you definitely have stuff. Now, in terms of, I guess, what employers say, I mean, this is what they actually tell us. All the stuff that I'm talking about was basically taken from employer feedback. What they want is that level of detail. They want you to quantify and qualify what you say. Back everything up. This is why those examples that I've just gone through are so important. It actually demonstrates you know what you're talking about. You are actually doing the things you say. And if you can do that, then you can make a really strong application. Now, as we're summing up, there's a couple of things I did want to sort of touch on. I talked about motivation at the start. This is where that research that I talked about is so important. Because all throughout your application, you can be throwing in things that you've researched about the company. This will demonstrate why you want to work for them. So things like their website, things like their social media, Facebook, Insta, LinkedIn, TikTok even. Look at what they're talking about and reflect that when you are making these applications. Reflect it in your examples, reflect it in the things that you put in your application. It will again raise the level of your application just a little and demonstrate again that you have motivation, that you want to work there. That's what we're after. Okay, and just to sum up, I mean, I've talked a lot about the things you need to do, but these are, I guess, the 4 key points, right? You start by researching the company and researching what it is they're actually looking for. That's really easy to do. You can get that straight from a job spec or a person specification and use that to reflect the language they use in their application, in your application rather. And then what you really need to do all the way through is look at what they're asking for, these key skills, these key competencies, and use the STAR technique to hit them, to demonstrate them. Now, like I said, if you do have any questions while I'm summing up, please feel free to put them in the chat. If there's anything I haven't touched on that you felt like you really wanted to, that's absolutely fine. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming. I will stop the recording there.